December 12, 1944. The outskirts of New York City. The bitter winter wind whipped against the narrow streets, rattling shutters and carrying the faint smoke of coal fires. Hauptmann Karl Richter, a German officer recently reassigned to intelligence, ducked under the low-hanging eaves of a bombed-out building. He wasn't in Europe this time. He and a small contingent of German spies had been transported to the U.S. under a false identity mission, tasked with assessing civilian morale and industrial capacity. The streets were unusually quiet. Children had vanished indoors, and the occasional figure moved briskly carrying parcels or trudging through snow. But it wasn't the eerie stillness that unsettled Richter. It was the signs that America was prepared. Far too prepared. "Captain, you see that Sergeant Otto Weber whispered, pointing to a reinforced doorway half buried in snow. It wasn't just a basement. The steel door gleamed under a street lamp reinforced with riveted plates. A small plaque read, "Civil Defense Shelter. Capacity 120. Richter's eyes narrowed. "A basement," he muttered, taking a cautious step closer. He knew the urban underground of Europe, knew what survival looked like during bombings. He had witnessed Cologne and Dresden flattened by Allied raids. But this was something else. The door opened with a mechanical hiss, and the two men stepped inside. A staircase led down into a space lit by dim, flickering electric lights, a luxury Richter had not anticipated. Rows of metal bunks lined the walls, stocked neatly with blankets and small personal lockers. Long shelves ran the length of the room, filled with tinned foods, cans of water medical kits, even rationed chocolate. He heard Weber gasp. This is like a small army barracks." Richter nodded slowly. His fingers traced the smooth steel of a first aid station. "Look at this, Otto. Look at the planning, the engineering. Reinforced concrete ventilation systems, water tanks. Entire neighborhoods could survive weeks underground without touching the outside." The officers moved further into the shelter. In a corner, they found a small radio console, battery-powered, tuned to civil defense frequencies. Papers were neatly stacked nearby: evacuation plans, neighborhood contact charts, schedules for local air raid wardens. Each item was cataloged, labeled, and ready. This wasn't improvisation. This was preparation on a scale Richter had never imagined. He thought of the Blitz back home. London had shelters, yes, but cramped, temporary, and under constant threat of collapse. Here in the heart of enemy territory, civilians had built entire networks of survival. And with the industrial capacity America had, Richter knew these weren't isolated cases. Entire cities must be fortified like this. A muffled cough drew their attention. Two American men emerged from a side tunnel, civilian volunteers checking supply inventories. One looked up, startled by the intruders, and barked a sharp question in English. Richter instinctively ducked behind a support beam. Weber hissed in German, "Do we engage?" "No." Richter said quietly. His eyes scanned the stockpiles again. He realized then that fighting in these streets would not be a simple matter. Civilians weren't defenseless. They were organized, prepared. The war machine wasn't only in factories and armies. It was here quietly underground. Richter's thoughts raced. How many soldiers had been tasked with air raids only to see their targets undamaged? How many logistical calculations in Berlin had underestimated American resilience? Every tin of food, every reinforced wall, every volunteer in these shelters was a cog in an unstoppable engine. And he, a soldier trained to gauge enemy weakness, could find none. The officers moved on, inspecting shelter after shelter, each larger than the last, some capable of holding hundreds, some with medical stations rivaling field hospitals. Others stocked with chemical suits, sanitation kits, even detailed maps of subway escape routes. By the time they emerged back into the bitter cold, Richter's mind was awash with a single thought: the enemy's capacity for survival, for endurance, was staggering. Weber broke the silence. Hauptmann, they can outlast any bombing we send. Richter said nothing, staring at the snow falling over the streetlights. He knew this reconnaissance would have consequences. Reports would reach Berlin, and the generals would understand that the American home front was no weak point. It was a fortress buried beneath the streets themselves. By late December 1944, Hauptmann Karl Richter and Sergeant Weber had spent several days navigating the streets of New York, Chicago, and smaller cities along the eastern seaboard under assumed identities. Each day, the evidence of America's extraordinary preparedness grew more undeniable. What had begun as curiosity now weighed on Richter like a lead coat. In a converted warehouse in Buffalo, and the pair were led into another underground complex, this one larger than any previous shelter. The entrance was guarded by young volunteers in olive green civil defense uniforms, rifles slung casually, but eyes sharp. Richter recognized the distinction immediately. These weren't untrained civilians. They were organized, armed, and disciplined enough to execute emergency drills across an entire city. The interior was cavernous. Rows of steel bunks kitchens capable of serving hundreds at a time, and medical wings equipped with X-ray machines and triage tables. Even in the faint light, Richter could see carefully labeled caches of ammunition, fuel, and engineering tools. An electric generator hummed steadily, keeping the fluorescent lights alive and water pumps flowing. This is insane. Weber muttered, his voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged chamber. They can withstand a direct hit. Days, weeks, even months underground. Richter moved to a corner and picked up a schematic pinned to the wall. The diagram detailed every tunnel, emergency exit, air filtration system, and supply depot in the surrounding city blocks. The notation even included rotations for volunteer wardens, schedules for ration distribution, and instructions for coordinating with fire and police departments. Every scenario had been anticipated, every contingency planned. He could hardly breathe. His mind raced back to Berlin, to the offices of the High Command, where officers debated bombing schedules and supply line calculations. They had assumed that strategic air raids would cripple America's industrial output. But these shelters told a different story. Even in the event of repeated attacks, civilians could survive, factories could continue to function, and morale would remain intact. Richter's voice was low, almost to himself. It's not just preparation. It's an entire infrastructure of survival. And they have the resources to maintain it indefinitely. Weber nodded slowly. I have never seen anything like it in Germany, not even in fortified cities like Hamburg or Munich. They've taken the idea of civilian defense and weaponized it with engineering, logistics, and manpower. It's terrifying. The pair wandered further, entering a storage wing filled with crates of preserved food, water purifiers, blankets, and medical supplies. There were even shelves dedicated to civilian comforts, books, games, musical instruments. It wasn't just survival. They had created a semblance of normal life underground. Richter realized with a shiver that these shelters would not only preserve lives, but spirits. Morale, he understood, was as much a weapon as a rifle. Outside, the winter wind carried the sounds of the city trains, rumbling distant church bells, children's laughter muffled by walls of concrete. Inside, however, was an entirely different reality. A fortress where order and organization reigned supreme, where every citizen had a role, and every eventuality was accounted for. Richter had witnessed many military installations in his career, but none rivaled the precision and foresight of these civilian networks. He turned to Weber, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lighting. "Otto, report this. Every detail. Berlin needs to understand, attacking the U.S. isn't just facing an army. It's facing a nation that has engineered survival itself. They are invincible in ways we cannot match." Weber's expression mirrored Richter's shock. "Invincible, yes. But we can still strike." Richter shook his head. "No, not in the way we imagined. Factories, civilians, infrastructure, all protected. We bomb, they rebuild. We starve, they ration. Every assumption we have about weakness is wrong." As the two officers left the underground, stepping back into the cold night air, the reality sank in. The snow-covered streets seemed peaceful, almost quaint. But Richter now knew better. Beneath the city lay an invisible army, tens of thousands of civilians, fully trained, fully equipped, and ready to withstand any assault. Their resilience was a testament not just to American ingenuity, but to a level of preparation Germany could never match under the pressures of total war. Richter's pen scratched feverishly across a small notebook as they walked back to their safe house. Each observation, each schematic, each detail of these shelters would be sent back to Berlin. The Germans were always confident in their strategic superiority, but now confronted with the magnitude of American logistics and planning. Richter understood that the home front of the United States was a fortress beyond imagining. The officer in him, trained to calculate odds and weaknesses, found none. Every pathway, every contingency had been anticipated. Every citizen was a cog in an enormous, unyielding machine. He glanced at the glowing streetlights reflecting off the freshly fallen snow and whispered to himself, "They've built more than shelters. They've built a nation that cannot fall." December 13th, 1944. Brooklyn, New York. The streets were slick with ice, the faint echo of horse-drawn carts mingling with the occasional rumble of motor trucks delivering coal. Hauptmann Karl Richter and Sergeant Weber had been guided by a local volunteer, a stern-faced woman named Margaret Klein, to one of the city's largest civilian bomb shelters, an entire block converted into a subterranean refuge capable of holding over 800 people. The entrance was a heavy steel gate, manned by teenagers in civil defense armbands who checked identification cards and ration permits. A low hum of conversation drifted from below, punctuated by the clatter of pots and pans and the occasional barked instruction from shelter supervisors. Richter, who had grown accustomed to silence and fear in European cities, was immediately struck by the atmosphere calm, organized, even purposeful. "Everyone has a role," Margaret said, noticing the officers' wide-eyed expressions. "We have shifts for cooking, sanitation, communication, even entertainment. Keeps morale high." The officers followed her down a steep staircase into a massive cavern beneath the city streets. The scale was staggering. Rows of bunks were arranged with military precision. Children played quietly under the watchful eyes of volunteers. Nurses moved briskly between rows of cots, tending to minor injuries and illness. A separate section housed medical equipment that rivaled a small field hospital, stretchers, surgical kits, sterilization units, even a small X-ray machine. Richter's gaze swept over the shelves stocked with tinned meats, beans, flour, sugar, and water canisters. Not a single item was haphazardly placed. Everything was cataloged, labeled, and rotated according to expiration dates. In a corner, a volunteer meticulously maintained a ledger, tracking every ration distributed to the shelter's inhabitants. He crouched beside one of the stacks of supplies, running his fingers over the cans. "Otto, this is extraordinary," he murmured. "Weeks, maybe months underground. No panic, no chaos. Not a single detail left to chance." Weber, standing near a bank of communication radios, added quietly, "And the children? They are taught drills. They know the routines better than we know our own barracks. Richter nodded. He realized then that the German assumptions about civilian vulnerability had been utterly flawed. In Europe, bombings had often led to chaos, hunger, and fear. Civilians were collateral damage. Here in America, civilians were a force multiplier, trained, prepared, and protected. The shelter was more than concrete and steel. It was a manifestation of national will. Margaret led them through the recreational area. Children painted pictures, teenagers played chess, and adults organized small concerts with donated instruments. There was laughter, the occasional murmur of conversation, and an almost surreal sense of normality. Richter's mind struggled to reconcile this with the war raging above ground in Europe. How could a nation so under threat maintain such calm and ordered discipline, preparation, and morale? Margaret explained when she noticed Richter's fascination. We survive because we are organized. Fear only wins if we let it. Richter wrote furiously in his notebook, documenting every observation, every logistical detail. He noted the meticulous rotation of volunteers, the storage and maintenance of supplies, the medical readiness, and even the psychological support programs for children and adults alike. This is not merely survival, he muttered. This is resilience engineered. Every shelter is a miniature city capable of operating independently. And with thousands like this. He paused, staring at the bustling underground community. Germany cannot hope to disrupt it entirely. As they ascended the staircase back to the snow-covered streets, Richter felt the weight of reality pressing down. The U.S. home front was not a passive civilian base, but an active fortified entity, capable of withstanding aerial attacks, ration shortages, and even chemical threats. Every citizen was trained, every supply cached, and every contingency considered. Outside, the wind stung his cheeks, carrying the distant sounds of trains and urban bustle. Richter took a deep breath, feeling the bitter cold, and whispered to Weber, "We are not just fighting an army. We are fighting a people prepared for war in every conceivable way." Weber, exhaling a fog of icy air, nodded gravely. "And they will endure. No bombing, no rationing, no strike can break this. Not like Europe. Not ever." Richter's hand tightened around his notebook. This reconnaissance would shake Berlin when it arrived. The generals would have to confront a chilling truth even if they conquered Europe. The American industrial and civilian fortress would remain untouchable, a resilient engine that could feed armies, rebuild cities, and sustain morale indefinitely. The realization settled into Richter's mind with a cold finality. The German war machine, formidable as it was, had met a force beyond bullets and tanks, an entire nation, prepared, disciplined, and determined to survive. January 3rd, 1945. A dimly lit safe house in Manhattan. Hauptmann Karl Richter and Sergeant Otto Weber sat hunched over a small battered wooden table, flicking through their notes and sketches of American bomb shelters. The city outside was alive with the normal hum of winter traffic, oblivious to the war raging thousands of miles away in Europe. Inside, however, the air was thick with urgency and dread. Richter placed a final sketch onto the table, a detailed diagram of a Brooklyn shelter capable of holding 800 civilians, complete, with separate medical communication and recreational sections. He tapped a pencil against the paper. "We must document everything. Every shelter, every supply cache, every rotation schedule. Berlin needs a complete picture." Weber exhaled, his voice low. "They've turned survival into an art form. Every citizen has a role. Every contingency is planned. Even the children are trained." Richter's eyes were sharp, his voice firm, but tinged with disbelief. "Our strategists assumed civilian panic would be inevitable in the event of bombing. That's what made morale a target. But here, there is no panic. Only order. Only readiness. This changes everything. By mid-January, their detailed reconnaissance had been encoded and transmitted to Berlin via secure channels. The report, titled Civil Defense and Urban Resilience in the United States, included schematics photographs taken surreptitiously with concealed cameras and meticulous notes on supplies, population capacities, and underground medical facilities. The response in Berlin was immediate. Officers in the high command gathered to assess the findings. General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel himself read portions of the report aloud. The enemy has constructed extensive underground shelters, some capable of holding over 1,000 civilians, with full medical and logistical support. Each shelter is a self-contained unit with air filtration, electricity, and rations for weeks. Morale is maintained through training and community roles. A murmur of shock passed through the room. The intelligence officers, accustomed to reports of weak or poorly organized civilian populations, could hardly comprehend the scale and sophistication of these shelters. Every assumption about America's vulnerability, every plan to leverage bombing campaigns for strategic advantage was called into question. Generals debated in urgent, tense voices. If civilians survive bombing raids, intact industrial output continues, one officer said, voice sharp. Our air campaigns will be less effective than anticipated. They are not just resilient, they are invincible in practical terms. Richter's own report had understated little. He had detailed how neighborhoods operated like military units. Volunteers rotated shifts in kitchens, medical stations, and communication posts. Recreational areas kept morale high. Strict rationing ensured sustainability. Even in prolonged attacks, Americans could survive and maintain societal order underground. The implications were staggering. German planners had long relied on the idea that strategic bombing could weaken American morale, slow production, and indirectly aid the Axis war effort. Now the reality painted by Richter and Weber's reconnaissance was a harsh contradiction. Civilians could endure almost anything, feeding the industrial engine that would inevitably supply armies on both the Pacific and European fronts. One officer, reviewing schematics, shook his head. If we strike factories, they rebuild. If we strike cities, civilians retreat and survive. Our calculations for strategic advantage are null. Richter, now back in Berlin, under secure escort, addressed a small council of officers. The shelters are not anomalies, he said. Every major city has them. Every city has a trained civilian corps. They are prepared to endure attacks that would destroy morale in Europe. This is not just engineering. This is national will made tangible. We cannot break it with conventional tactics. The council grew silent. Outside, snow fell over Berlin streets, darkened by wartime curfews. Inside, the officers grappled with the stark reality their perception of American weakness had been shattered. These underground fortresses were more than concrete and steel. They were symbols of a nation's industrial might and civilian resilience, immune to the chaos Germany had relied upon to gain advantage. Richter's report concluded with a chilling note. The German war machine faces a home front that cannot be broken by bombs or fear alone. Any strategy relying on civilian vulnerability is doomed. Prepare accordingly. The room remained quiet after the reading. Officers exchanged grave glances, realizing the war they had imagined, a war where bombing, attrition, and panic could tip the scales, was no longer possible. Across the Atlantic, Americans slept in their shelters unbroken, unaware of the psychological victory they had already won. January 17, 1945. Manhattan. The streets were quiet under a pale winter sun. Snow crusted along the sidewalks, and the occasional trolley clattering along the rails. Hauptmann Karl Richter stood atop a small hill overlooking a residential district, binoculars in hand, surveying the subtle hum of city life. Children ran between buildings, women carried shopping bags, and the occasional man in a trench coat hurried to work. At first glance, it looked like any peaceful city in wartime. Yet Richter knew better. Beneath these streets, a different world thrived. He remembered the first shelter he had entered weeks ago. The hissing steel doors, the rows of bunks, the meticulous stacks of food and medical supplies. He remembered the radio consoles, the rotation charts for volunteers, the children practicing air raid drills as if it were second nature. And he remembered Margaret Klein's words spoken softly as they navigated through the labyrinthine tunnels, "Fear only wins if we let it." Otto Weber joined him, wrapping his coat tighter against the biting wind. "I've never seen discipline like that. Not in the Wehrmacht, not in any European city," he muttered. "And the civilians, they aren't afraid. They are prepared." Richter lowered his binoculars and exhaled slowly. He could still feel the chill from the concrete shelters, the faint hum of generators, the low murmur of organized voices echoing through underground halls. Each detail had been etched into his mind, each image a reminder of the resilience he had witnessed. "They've taken survival and turned it into an art," Richter said quietly. "Every detail accounted for. Every contingency, even the war itself, is anticipated in these shelters. They do not cower. They endure. They adapt. And they will outlast anything we can throw at them." As they walked through the streets, the city seemed almost serene. Yet Richter's thoughts were heavy with implications. The U.S. home front was more than a sanctuary for civilians. It was the backbone of a vast industrial engine, producing tanks, ships, aircraft, and ammunition at a pace Germany could not match. Every shelter they had visited, every citizen trained and ready, ensured that this engine would keep running. "We underestimated them," Weber said finally. "We assumed fear would spread, that hunger or bombing would break them. But now, I see it. The calculations we made in Berlin, they were flawed." Richter's gaze lingered on a modest apartment building. Snowflakes drifted gently against the windows, warm light spilling onto the sidewalk below. He imagined the families inside, children tucked in beneath blankets, adults quietly preparing their underground havens for another day. There was an almost defiant strength in their ordinariness, the very thing that made them dangerous. Returning to their temporary safe house, Richter pulled out his notebook once more. His hand moved across the pages, documenting the final impressions of their journey. The engineering marvels, the disciplined civilians, the morale-boosting measures, and the sheer scale of preparedness. He knew that these notes would reverberate through German command structures, sending a chilling message to officers who had long believed in the vulnerability of the American populace. "Even if we win battles overseas," Richter said to Weber, closing the notebook, "the war here, on the home front, is already lost. Not because of soldiers, but because of a people prepared beyond measure." Weber nodded. Silence fell between them, punctuated only by the distant clatter of the city and the soft wind over the rooftops. Both men understood that this experience would haunt them for the remainder of the conflict, and the stark realization that American resilience was an invisible, unbreakable fortress, one that no bombs, no raids, no strategy could easily penetrate. As the day faded into twilight, Richter stood once more overlooking the city. The snow sparkled faintly, and a faint hum of distant traffic carried through the cold air. Beneath him, beneath the streets, the shelters lay silent, but ready, a subterranean testament to human ingenuity, discipline, and unwavering determination. Richter whispered under his breath, almost in awe, "They have built more than shelters. They have built a nation that cannot fall." And in that moment, he understood the true scale of the challenge facing Germany. The industrial and civilian might of the United States was not merely formidable, it was inexhaustible. It was organized, unyielding, and prepared for the unimaginable. As night fell over Manhattan, Richter and Weber prepared to leave the city, but the images of the shelters, the disciplined volunteers, and the quiet strength of American civilians remained seared in their minds. The war had many fronts, but they had witnessed one that would determine its outcome, the invisible, unassailable fortress of the American home front.